government has highlighted localization as the main policy objective for economic recovery. This month, Treasury banned the use of imported cement on all government-funded projects. In a circular to all relevant state departments, Treasury says that in terms of its preferential procurement regulations, no imported cement can be used on projects funded by government as of the 4th of November. It's a move that couldn't have come at a better time, given the multi-billion rand infrastructure projects planned by government over the next 3 years. But what are the effects of localization policies? Do they have the buy-in of all the stakeholders? And what has been the impact of such policies on our economy? Let's discuss this with business, with labor, and the Free Market Foundation. I'm joined by Cosatu's Parliamentary Coordinator, Matthew Parks, in Cape Town. We've got Business Unity South Africa CEO, Coovadia, and Chris Hattingh, who is the project manager at the Free Market Foundation. Thank you, gentlemen, for joining me for this discussion. Let's start with you, Mr. Coovadia. How do you understand this going to work? I mean, are you going to have departments stipulating in tender invitations that only SA-produced cement produced with locally sourced raw materials will be allowed for use on public sector construction projects? And how have you responded to these policies as business?
Well, I'm not too sure how it will work. I think it does government that. Because they'd have to ensure that they can actually vouch that it's locally produced and so on. But that's an issue for government. From our point of view, we've been interacting with government, particularly the GTIC, for quite some time on localization, and we've actually put together a localization working group that's looking at specific product areas that we could actually jack up local manufacturing on. But we've also indicated that you can't do this through some sort of a diktat, if you like. Different products will have different characteristics depending on the regulatory environment, depending on skills and capacity, depending on our industrial capacity to manufacture certain products. So we'd have to take it on a product-by-product basis and identify which we can actually manufacture and manufacture at scale in the short term, what environment needs to be in place for others in the medium to long term. We would also urge that this be done in a way that does not have flow through in other parts of the economy from the point of view of costs and so on. So if locally manufactured products need to compete with imported products. Otherwise, prices go up, costs go up, and those eventually get generated or see their way through the system into a situation where consumers eventually have to bear that cost. So we had some work done, an independent study on localization. It showed that businesses are in favor of localization, but provided we do it properly, we are competitive in what we manufacture locally, and we do this in a way that actually is within the concept of a free market economy.
Yeah. Mr. Parks, as Labour, have you done similar work as well? And what's been your observation of how these policies have been implemented so far?
Yes, no, we've been supporting local procurement for government, for the SOEs, for municipalities, for the private sector, even for workers and consumers at large. It's a critical way to save local manufacturing jobs. If we get it right, we actually create hundreds of thousands of badly needed jobs in an economy which is in a deep recession with 44% unemployment rate. So we're quite happy, we're quite excited by this announcement by Treasury. It's something we've actually been calling for specifically for cement. We think it's going to be a saving intervention to the local manufacturers who have really been battling cheap, subsidized imports, often underpriced, which flood into the economy. Often they don't even pay customs duties when they come in, they're legally brought in. So this is quite a critical role, and especially when you consider that government is embarking upon a 1.6 trillion rand infrastructure rollout program over the next few years. This can inject huge amounts of local money to the local economy. It can save these companies, can enable additional companies to grow, create new jobs. It can help to position the cement manufacturing industry to actually export to neighboring states and to Africa as well. So this really is critical. We've seen positive green shoots in other parts of the economy when you push local procurement. So in the clothing industry, we've seen many companies being able to set up to get contracts from the retailers to create new jobs, etc. But we've seen with the master plans, when there's a collaboration between government and business and labor, we've actually been able to grow jobs. So there are really many positive aspects we can speak to around poultry, around textiles, even around sugar, etc. Then we need to look at how can we push this further. So we think on the construction front, the next step should be to around how can we support local steel manufacturers? Can we extend this to protective equipment, protective gear that we locally produce? Can we extend it to machines as well, trucks, etc.? So there are huge opportunities. All the successful economies in the world have done this route, whether it's the US, whether it's Europe, whether it's China, whether it's Australia. So these are the most we should be looking at and really can help us save badly needed jobs and create many jobs as well.
Yeah, Mr. Hattingh, how do we do it right? Because there are implications there. As Mr. Coovadia mentioned, there are implications in terms of inflation, in terms of imports. You don't want to get consumers ending up bearing the brunt, really. What concerns do you have about this approach? Because it may work in the short term, but I know you've raised some concerns about what could be the implications in the long term.
Thank you, Clement, and good afternoon to Mr. Parks and Mr. Coovadia as well. Yeah, I think over the short term, localization could definitely create some jobs for those businesses which happen to be the beneficiaries of subsidies. So if that is communicated openly and transparently, those businesses and corporations can well benefit and some jobs can be created. But over the long term, I would argue that subsidies are a form of price distortion, and therefore businesses don't respond very accurately to market demand and supply. So over the long term, those supply chains that one might build up overnight are not going to last long over the long term in terms of future shocks. I'm sure there are going to be future pandemics and that kind of thing heading our way in coming years. If you look at the moment, the global container crunch, the crunch of shipping supplies and that kind of thing, I think South Africa should rather be focusing on lowering barriers to trade, tariffs, that kind of thing, both for imports and exports to better benefit low to middle income consumers. Also in terms of addressing the 44% unemployment rate, as Mr. Parks correctly pointed out, we can't do that without capital formation and investment and skills development, and we need to get as much sort of help and input from around the world as possible, of course, unique to our context, of course, and our own needs and desires. But trade, you know, from a holistic point of view, trade isn't just about goods and services. It's also about expertise, knowledge, skills, that kind of thing coming across borders. So instead of localization, we argue that government at the moment should look at how it can implement the Africa Free Trade Area to make the flow of goods and services easier across sub-Saharan Africa and indeed the African continent. It is a concern from our point of view that localization in some ways might potentially undermine the sort of goals and ideals of the AFCFTA.
Yeah. Mr. Coovadia, do you think it undermines those goals? I know there have been concerns from some that this may be viewed as a form of protectionism, but government has said, well, we've signed the World Trade Organization agreements. That's not really protectionism. And where do you see, I suppose, foreign markets playing here and also perhaps supporting the wider economic development and promoting employment and growth?
I think we absolutely clear, and that's why we worked on this and we've got a working group on this, that localization is an element of our economic growth. I think to say that localization is the element, we wouldn't agree with that. I think it's an element of our economic growth. I think that if we get it right, and if we concentrate on the right products where we have a competitive advantage, where we have the skills and we can actually manufacture to scale, we could even export, and it would help in exporting, and it would then we could actually interact with the African Free Trade Agreement. So I think that to me, the question here is how do we go about this? It's not a question of whether we do it. It's how do we go about it, that we actually recognize that we are a relatively small economy in global terms. We can't just say that we're going to have a percentage of import substitution by a particular point of time. Businesses just don't work that way. We've got to understand what's happening in our trading partners. We've got to understand where we are in the global economy. We've got to understand that we need to promote local manufacturing to actually create jobs. But let's do that in a way that also takes into account the other levers we need to pull to actually bring about economic growth and to actually encourage investment. And what we should be doing is we should be conducting our localization efforts in a way that actually encourages investment, both local and foreign, and begins to demonstrate that we have the capacity to actually manufacture a diversified range of goods, and we have the capacity to do that competitively and in a way that actually does not bring about any other negative consequences to the economy and to inflation and to prices. Yeah. And that's the debate we need to have. The debate is not whether we have localization.
Yeah. Mr. Parks, what have you observed so far? I mean, is it being implemented competitively? Because what some institutions have raised concerns about is the lack of enforcement in ensuring that you're checking if these policies are implemented correctly. Some people go overseas to buy products, come back to the country, and they get these contracts, and they're saying, well, we are South African companies. So there's no enforcement and thorough checks as to whether what they are offering and what the services they are providing and the products are locally produced. Where do you think the improvements should be at? And what do you make of where enforcement is when it comes to the implementation of these policies?
Sure. Look, that's a critical point. That's been one of the weakest links. So there is a need for a single public procurement system for the entire state, not just the public service departments, but also to include SOEs, municipalities, entities, who often have been a law unto themselves and are huge leakages in the state, and also equally have huge procurement budgets. So this is the positive step because it's a directive compelling the entire state, not just the departments. The second other critical part is around customs enforcement. Currently, only about 5% of our goods coming through our ports of entry are inspected for customs duties. Even those, many of them, fraudulently underreport the value of the items. So there's a need to invest in SARS, to capacitate it, to crack down on customs evasion. So you need to inspect not just 5% of goods, but 100%. Collect the right amount of customs due. That also help to generate revenue for the state, to help to protect local manufacturing sectors, protect local jobs and so forth. But also government needs to show a little bit of fortitude and hold entities within the state accountable. If they'd failed to abide by it, action needs to be taken. That's how you're going to change culture. But I think from our side, this is a critical intervention. We believe it is correct to protect local jobs, to protect local manufacturing sectors. We shouldn't be ashamed of it. All countries in the right mind do that. But also we want to make the appeal to business, not to squander this opportunity, because these interventions are of a short, medium-term nature by design. The real investment needs to happen around investing in the skills of the workers, investing in the company's capacities, addressing inefficiencies so they can remain competitive longer term, so they can also export to other countries. But we also need to ensure that government does protect local industries from dumping by other countries, many of whom dump subsidized goods, not competitive goods, but subsidized goods. And this is what we have seen in clothing, in poultry, in sugar, etc., even in steel. So these are the things we also need to do. It's not a level playing field. So we shouldn't be imposing excessive conditions on South African companies, yet our competitors who dump their goods here have a free-for-all. And I think we need to be realistic around that. But I think also lastly, Clement, is that government can do so much, business can do so much, and they should do more. But also us as consumers, ordinary workers, should also be active when we go to the stores to buy food, to buy clothing, to buy furniture, to buy vehicles, to make sure we buy locally produced goods, because this is the greatest way of protecting jobs and to creating jobs and to stimulating the local economies to get us out of this recession.
Yeah. Mr. Hattingh, how do you think this can be done in a way that doesn't really see us looking at the negative consequences in the long term. Mr. Coovadia raises an important issue of this is not a debate about whether or not to get into localization. It's already being implemented, but it's a conversation about how to do it in a way that still ensures competitiveness, in a way that doesn't really get consumers bearing the brunt and affecting our economy negatively. What are your proposals as the Free Market Foundation on how this can be done properly?
I think using the WTO, the World Trade Organization, arbitration rules will be very useful for any countries looking to implement these kinds of policies, and also going to the appellate body. So if, for example, the master plans are gazetted and the meetings and minutes and processes weren't done in a very transparent and objective manner, then companies which feel that they bear the brunt of anti-competitive behavior can then try and work through the World Trade Organization, through other international bodies, to try and change these policies in some ways that they are more efficient and transparent. So we think communication is key. It's very important to play open cards, as it were, with everyone in the economy, all the stakeholders, businesses, importers, exporters, warehousing, all of that kind of thing. We do want to give government a note of credit, especially on the ports side, because Minister Pravin Gordhan has noted that they'll be looking at procuring and bringing in more investment into the port sector. That will help improve South Africa's general trading footing, as it were. And again, we encourage the government to look at the spirit and policies of the Africa Free Trade Area and to make sure that any localization policies are formed and implemented in the spirit of that, to ensure that the African continent as a whole benefits from more increased trade. It has been proven time and again that where trade is more liberalized and more free, on average, quality of life increases more. And at this point in time, what more do we all want for South Africa and for South Africans than to get job creation and economic growth going in a proper, sustainable and long-term kind of way?
Yeah, gentlemen, thank you so much for joining me for this discussion. Cosatu's Parliamentary Coordinator, Matthew Parks, Business Unity South Africa CEO, Coovadia, and Chris Hattingh, who is a Project Manager at the Free Market Foundation. I appreciate your time.